Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've brewed around Ashling, Flame Dancer. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but this cost doesn't include things such as shipping. Anyway, Ashling, Flame Dancer is a 4/4 legendary elemental shaman costing 2 red and 2 generic to cast with 2 abilities. The first makes it so you don't lose unspent red mana as steps and phases end, which basically means you keep it around indefinitely, including across other players' turns, so long as Ashling remains on the battlefield. Then Ashling's second ability has you discard a card, then draw a card, whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery. But if it's the second time that ability triggered in a turn, Ashling also deals 2 damage to each opponent and their creatures, giving you a one-sided weenies board wipe. And if it's the third time it triggered that turn, you put 4 red mana into your mana pool. So with abilities like that, Ashling is going to want a deck built around spell slinging. So unlike most of my decks, this deck's non-land cards will primarily be made up of instant and sorcery spells, with a comparative smattering of permanents here and there to generally give us more value out of our non-permanent spells, as generally we'll be looking to frequently trigger Ashling's second ability 2 to 3 times in a turn cycle, as often as possible to get its full effect. Given Mono Red's propensity to burn through its hand, we'll be relying on impulse draw a lot to keep us in the game, giving us temporary access to more spells to hopefully get Ashling's triggers off more consistently through turn cycles, and given how important it is to avoid having nothing left to cast, these effects make up a massive proportion of our instants and sorceries. We'll also have some spells that let us make copies of the instant and sorcery spells that we cast, which will frequently let us hit Ashling's third trigger to get extra mana after only casting 2 spells, and there's a handful of permanents that will give us more value from casting instant and sorcery spells, or giving us some value from the cards that we're discarding, along with a few ways to make Ashling's damage even more potent. I should also mention before jumping into the 99 of this deck that this deck has kind of a weird relation with mana sources, and was honestly a bit of a challenge to balance having enough ramp and land to get Ashling out and motoring consistently and without having to mulligan too much, but also making it so you don't feel overly flushed with uncast or unplayed mana sources late game. Ashling can provide a hefty amount of mana as the turns progress, which really throws off how useful mana permanents are, though obviously you still need plenty of them to get the game started. And to go along with that, I've generally found that lands early on will still be played from your hand, but as Ashling starts getting going, I'm frequently discarding lands in the hand with Ashling's ability and instead playing those that were exiled using impulse draw. But with that all being said, let's jump into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble to let us tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and Mindstone and Prismatic Lens are here for a bit of generic mana production. Felwar Stone has a decent chance to tap for red mana in a commander game, but if not, it can at least help us pay for generic costs. And Iron Mirror, Fire Diamond, and Arcane Signet will provide us with red mana. And then for some less standard mana production, we have Runaway Steamkin, Stormkiln Artist, and Rodeo Pyromancers, each of which can provide a good chunk of mana in this deck as the game progresses. Runaway Steamkin gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you cast a red spell, provided it has less than 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and then you can remove 3 +1/+1 counters from it to add 3 red mana to your mana pool. Stormkiln Artist makes a treasure token whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, and Rodeo Pyromancers gives you 2 red mana whenever you cast your first spell each turn. But with that out of the way, I'd like to move on to the plethora of spells focused around drawing or accessing cards. Really quickly, we have Faithless Looting as a low-cost way to potentially sculpt your hand a little bit, having you draw 2 and then discard 2 for 1 red mana. Then, Glimpse the Impossible has you exile the top 3 cards of your library, which you can play that turn, though any cards remaining in exile this way at the start of your end step are put into the graveyard, and you make a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn token that can be sacked to add a generic mana for each card put into your graveyard that way. Galvanic Relay has you exile the top card of your library, which you can play during your next turn. But this spell has Storm, where, when you cast the spell, you copy it for each spell that was cast before it that turn. Blazing Crescendo lets you buff a target creature by +3/+1 for the turn, and exile the top card of your library, which you can play until the end of your next turn. And Nahiri's Warcrafting deals 5 damage to a target creature, planeswalker, or battle, so it's a bit of interaction. But if excess damage were dealt by the spell, you look at the top X cards of your library, with X being the amount of excess damage, which you can exile one of those cards to play that turn, with the rest being put onto the bottom of your library in a random order. Then moving on to our more standard impulse type effects, we have, well, Reckless Impulse, simply having you exile the top 2 cards of your library, which you can play until the end of your next turn. Then Light Up the Stage, Monastery Raid, and Embrace the Unknown do the same as Reckless Impulse, but with some extra bits. Light Up the Stage can be cast for a single red mana if an opponent had lost life that turn. Monastery Raid lets you cast it for its free running cost of X and a red if you dealt combat damage with your commander, or technically an assassin, that turn, to potentially exile more than 2 cards if you pay into X enough. And Embrace the Unknown can be cast from your graveyard if you discard a land in addition to paying its mana costs. Ignite the Future and Inspired Tinkering each have you exile the top 3 cards of your library to play until the end of your next turn, though Ignite the Future lets you play those cards without paying their mana cost if it was cast from the graveyard, and Inspired Tinkering makes 3 treasure tokens. Commune with Lava and March of Reckless Joy are X-cost impulse draw spells, having you exile the top X cards of your library, which you can play until the end of your next turn, with the latter also giving you the option to exile red cards from your hand to effectively pay for 2 generic mana. Then, for our final set of effect types, Change of Fortune, Vindictive Flamestoker, and Magus of the Wheel all resemble wheel type effects, which can help give us a boost after we've inevitably ran out of cards in hand. Change of Fortune has you discard your hand and then draw a card for each card you discarded that turn, which, provided you make this among the last spells that you cast in a turn, you'll likely be growing your hand a bit, as Ashling likely had you discard beforehand. Then Vindictive Flamestoker can be sacked to discard your hand and draw 4, with the cost to access that effect lowered each time you cast a non-creature spell down to a minimum of 1 red mana. And Magus of the Wheel is just straight up a wheel on a creature, where you can sack Magus of the Wheel to have each player discard their hand and draw 7 cards. But now let's move on to the spells that we can use to make copies of the instant and sorcery spells that we cast. First up, Double Cast, Twinferno, and Dual Strike all give you the ability to copy the next instant or sorcery spell that you cast and choose new targets for the copy, though Dual Strike only works on instants and sorceries with mana value 4 or less, though that includes most of our spells, and Twinferno could also be used to give a creature we control Double Strike for the turn instead. Then Increasing Vengeance has you copy a target instant or sorcery spell you control, but if you cast Increasing Vengeance from the graveyard, you copy that spell twice instead. And Repeated Reverberation has the next instant or sorcery spell you cast copied twice. And Reverberate lets you copy a target instant or sorcery spell and choose new targets for the copy, which can work on our own spells, or it could be used as a bit of a counterspell protection, as you can copy the counterspell and then counter that counterspell with your copy of the counterspell. But we also have Dual Casting and Double Vision for doubling our spells. The former is an aura enchantment, giving its enchanted creature the ability to be tapped with 1 red mana to copy a target instant or sorcery spell you control, and the latter copies the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn. Now with that, I'd like to talk over some spells that trigger when we discard or when we cast instants or sorceries. First up, Conspiracy Theorist and Containment Construct kinda let us recycle the cards that we discard, as Conspiracy Theorist has it so when you discard 1 or more non-land cards, you can exile 1 of those cards from your graveyard to cast that turn, and Containment Construct has less restrictions, letting you exile any cards you were discarding to play that turn, including your lands. Then Glinthorn Buccaneer deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever you discard a card, which theoretically should happen a lot in this deck. And then Electrostatic Field is a 0/4 wall with Defender that deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell. And Gutter Snipe and Fiery Inscription deal 2 damage to each opponent whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell. Now for completionist's sake, Fiery Inscription also has the Ring Tempt You, though this really should only happen once in a game at most without some real shenanigans going on. So effectively for this deck, you just have to pick a creature to be your Ring Bearer, of which that creature becomes legendary if it wasn't already, and basically just gains a wordy version of Skulk, being unblockable by creatures with greater power. Then finally, Young Pyromancer makes a 1/1 red elemental creature token whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, which might help with blocking given how few creatures we actually have in this deck. But now let's go over some other effect types that we have in this deck which can really ramp things up or synergize well with the cards in this deck, but don't have massive representation in this deck for one reason or another. First up, we can really ramp up the damage we do with Ashling through Gratuitous Violence, Fiery Emancipation, and City on Fire. The first having creatures we control deal double damage to creatures or players, and the latter having your creatures deal triple damage to permanents or players. Then we have some graveyard recursion with Invoke Calamity, which lets you cast 2 instant and or sorcery spells with total mana value of 6 or less from your graveyard or hand without paying their mana costs, though they and Invoke Calamity are exiled instead of going back to the graveyard. Mizzix's Mastery has you exile an instant or sorcery spell from your graveyard, which you copy, and then you may cast that copy without paying its mana cost, with that spell and Mizzix's Mastery being exiled afterwards. but you could also cast this spell for its overload cost, where instead you'll exile each card that's an instant or sorcery in your graveyard, which can then copy and then cast those copies without paying their mana costs. And Arcane Bombardment is a fun one, as it has you exile an instant or sorcery at random from your graveyard when you cast your first instant or sorcery spell each turn. And then you can copy each card that's being exiled with Arcane Bombardment, and you may cast any number of those copies without paying their mana costs. And then Harmonic Prodigy makes it so if an ability of a shaman or wizard you control would trigger, it triggers twice instead, which will heavily reduce the amount we need to cast in order to achieve Ashling's burn or mana producing effects. And finally, given that Ashling deals damage to creatures, something like Gorgon's Head or Basilisk Collar, which give their equipped creatures Death Touch, can be incredibly mean but also powerful in this deck, as instead of a Weenie's board wipe after casting 2 instants and or sorceries, you now have a one-sided board wipe for all non-indestructible creatures. And that's not to mention that Basilisk Collar also gives you lifelink, so all that damage you're dealing is also going to turn into additional life for yourself. But now, let's go over the various interaction spells that we have in this deck. I'll start with our burn spells, with Shock dealing 2 damage to any target for 1 mana, and then Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning dealing 3 damage to any target for 1 red mana, though Chain Lightning does let the player or owner of the permanent that was dealt damage to pay 2 red to cast Chain Lightning themselves. Fiery Temper also deals 3 damage to any target, but if it was discarded, you can discard it into exile and cast it for its madness cost of just 1 red mana, which is great given how often it will be discarding with this deck. Grapeshot only deals 1 damage to any target, but it also has Storm to hopefully copy it multiple times when it does get cast. And Electro Dominance is an X cost spell dealing X damage to any target, but you can also cast a spell with mana value X or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. Then Abrade gives you the option to deal 3 damage to a target creature or destroy a target artifact. Shattering Spree is 1 mana to destroy a target artifact, but since it has Replicate, you can put more mana into it to make a bunch of copies, destroying more artifacts, and triggering Ashling's ability more. And Vandal Blast also destroys a target artifact you don't control for 1 red mana, though it can be cast for its overload cost instead to destroy each artifact you don't control for a one-sided artifact board wipe. Then Shunt, Return the Favor, and Bolt Bend each let you change the target of a target spell that has a single target, which could help us get Ashling or another one of our permanents out of a pinch, while Return the Favor could also be used to copy a target instant, sorcery, activated ability, or triggered ability. Then Wild Ricochet is a fun one, letting you choose new targets for a target instant or sorcery spell, then having you copy that spell, which you can choose new targets for that copy. And finally, Chaos Warp has the owner of a permanent shuffle that permanent into their library, and then reveal the top card of their library, which they can put onto the battlefield if it was a permanent card that was revealed. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's go over our land base. First up, Myriad Landscape can be sacked to tutor 2 basic lands of the same type onto the battlefield tapped. Then Forgotten Cave is a red producing land that could also be cycled for 1 red mana. And then cards in hand are always useful, so we have Bonder's Enclave and War Room, which give us access to draw on lands, with Bonder's Enclave requiring us to control a creature with power 4 or greater, which thankfully Ashling meets. And War Room would have us pay 1 life, as is a monocolored deck along with its mana costs. But finally, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 31 basic mountains. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing around $44.50 at the time of recording, which does include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but it doesn't include costs such as shipping. Now before I close out this video, there's a decent chunk of cards I'd like to suggest considering if you're wanting to upgrade or adapt this deck with a higher budget. First up, Ren's Resolve is effectively another copy of Reckless Impulse, though it recently got pretty expensive, especially for a recently printed common, though this was likely due to Ruby Storm and Modern being pretty popular at the release of Modern Horizons 3, and it seems like it's been slowly going down over the last little bit as I've been making this video, and it might be a more reasonably priced card in due time. Wheel of Misfortune, Wheel of Fate, and Reforge the Soul are all wheel effects, with all of them also being sorceries to trigger Ashling's ability, and would be a great way to rekindle your hand after burning through it. Currency Converter might not let you play the cards that you're discarding, but it gives you the chance to get some extra value out of them by exiling them with Currency Converter, then tapping the converter to put one of those exiled cards into your graveyard, of which you make a treasure token for land cards and a 2/2 black rogue creature token for non-land cards that were put into your graveyard this way. Then Torbrand, Thane of Redfell, has red sources we control deal 2 extra damage to an opponent or creature an opponent controls. while Furnace of Wrath and Dictate of the Twin Gods double pretty much all damage that's being done since it affects everyone's sources, not just our own. Then finally, Seething Song, Desperate Ritual, Pyretic Ritual, Mana Geyser, and Jeska's Will are all instances or sorceries that give a big, temporary boost in mana, either helping us get Ashling out early, of which she would then let us keep any excess mana, or just being a big spike in mana while she's out and counting as one of our instant and sorcery casts for a turn. But with that being said, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and maybe drop a sub if you'd like more budget commander decks in your feeds. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.